Every leader knows that a thriving organization depends on the energy, productivity, and commitment of its people. But few leaders are able to cultivate the employee engagement and performance needed for this level of success. What's the difference? Positive leadership practices. Welcome to the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast with your host, positive work culture expert, Alex Bratty. Ready to harness the power of positive leadership? Let's dive right in.
Hello and welcome to episode 37 of the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Bratty, and I am excited and intrigued to talk to our guest this week. His name is Ryan Berman, and he is the founder of Courageous, a change company that develops courage brands and trains organizations to challenge norms, think bolder, and take action on courageous ideas. Working with brands like Google, General Mills, Major League Baseball, Puma, Charity Water, Subway, and Caesars Entertainment, Ryan believes courage is a competitive advantage. He's also the founder of his own courage brand Sock Problems, an altruistic sock company that is socking problems in the world. And Ryan is here with us, taking time out of his very busy schedule to share what it means for us as leaders to become more courageous and why that matters and the return that you can expect when you follow his method. So Ryan, welcome. I am so grateful and honored to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Alex. Good to be here.
Absolutely. And we've so much to cover. I know we won't get through all of it, but let's dive in. I just love how you create a sense of intrigue about what you do, because when I asked you before the show, I always ask all guests, what's your definition of positive leadership? You said it was something called believership. And of course, that piqued my interest. So tell us about that. What is believership and how does it relate to positive leadership?
Yeah, this is what happens when you have a writer on your show, by the way. So, I had the opportunity to get quiet for 3 years and go around the country and interview people that were leading at Apple and Google and Method. And all this is in my book, Return on Courage. And one of the themes that kept coming up was that, of course, we need positive leadership. Mm-hmm. But poor leaders turn leadership into cheerleadership. And they start rah-rahing to their staff. Even like through a pandemic, we think what our staff needs is a pick-me-up. And that may work with 20% of the staff, but your high producers see right through it. And so what I liked is this concept of believership, which is a group of people that make up this believership. It's not like I'm the leader and everybody's following me. It's we're in this together.
Yep. And
the sole goal of that believership is to make believers in all directions. So make believers out of your staff, make believers out of your board. If you're a public company, obviously make a believer out of customers and consumers. Mm-hmm. And I think you even make believers or fake believers. Mm-hmm. And in the organization, if you have a fake believer walking around the office, it's not like they have a T-shirt on that says fake believer.
Right.
And that's part of the problem. Meanwhile, when you turn back, they're messing with your culture. It's creating toxicity. It's going exactly opposite of a positive leadership. And so, this is part of so I like the idea of like, do you believe or do you not believe? And we talk about a courageous leadership, our tagline being believe again.
I love that. And when you say believe, you mean believe in yourself, believe in the organization, believe in our purpose, in our mission. Is it, or D, all of the above?
Yeah, it's sort of an amalgamation of all the above. And how many times have you believed in the people you work for, but maybe not for the leadership?
Yes.
Or how many times have you believed in the people, but the product isn't up for snuff, so you stay. Mm-hmm. So again, it's kind of having to address all of these and getting it all right. And in some ways at Courageous, we describe ourselves as a business mechanic. Like we're looking under the hood of the company and looking at like, do we actually have our leadership in alignment? Do they have the right story that they're telling their team?
Right.
Is it aligned with the product that they're bringing to market?
Oh, which is so important, right? Because when those two things are out of alignment, forget it. There's not going to be a whole lot of believership happening in your organization. You got much bigger problems, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's part of the Look, one of my favorite case studies of all time is the Domino's pizza case study, where the CEO kind of greenlit a change. They used to be the value company, right? Meaning the 30 minutes or less company. So when pizza showed up in minute 31, you got free bad pizza. Congratulations.
Yeah.
And they started to reimagine their product. They went back to the well. And when they got their product tighter and they had testing that showed that the product was better, they could actually be more courageous with their marketing.
Yeah.
And now you look at their return on courage, they took the stock price from $3 to over $300 in a decade.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, a huge success story. So tell us about this when you talk about courage, because you have a huge focus on courage.
yeah.
And of course, courage can mean different things to different people. So tell us, what is your specific definition of courage when you're working with your clients and when you were writing your book? And we'll get to that in a minute. I definitely want to talk about your book too.
Yeah. So the definition so again, what actually sent me down the rabbit hole to write the book was looking at the dictionary definition of courage, which is the ability to do something that frightens one. Now, are you interested in doing that, Alex?
Sometimes,
Yeah.
only because I know, because I've been down that path, and I know that if I do something that frightens me, I'll usually be happy in the end, right? Like, we have to go through that process a few times and realize that we'll benefit from it if we, get out of the old proverbial comfort zone and do something that scares us, right?
I think there's a reason you're running this podcast. Yes. and other people aren't. And so you're on the curious journey and you're open to that. But most people are not interested in doing things that frighten them. And then you layer on, well, what about the work? Do you want to do some things that scare you at work? And if I ask the chief executive officer of my family, my wife, if she wants to leave San Diego anytime soon, which is where I live, the answer is no. So I have to be really careful of what I say at work, not to get myself fired, so I don't upset our chief home officer.
Right.
And so I think that's part of it, was nobody really wants to do willingly frightening things.
Right.
But I also didn't see the utilitarian value in that definition, because there are certain arenas where we need courage. I mean, as you've already stated, anywhere where change has to happen, there's going to be some conflict, and anywhere there's conflict, you're going to find courage. So I wanted to come up with a utilitarian definition that helped people in real time recognize the difference between a careless move and a courageous one. And my definition is knowledge plus faith plus action equals courage. And
I like that. Wait, repeat it so everybody gets it, because it's so powerful. Say it again.
So it's knowledge plus faith plus action equals courage.
Love it.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, I think, in business, think about when you started the podcast. So you're on episode 37. So let's go back to episode 2.
No, let's not.
Okay.
But okay.
Touche. So look, you have the knowledge to think that you can add value with your podcast.
Right.
You don't have 100% of the knowledge, right? But you have some knowledge to think this is the right move. And in companies, by the way, companies that think they're going to wait for 100% of the knowledge and they're collecting data till 2023, are going to get passed by a competitor.
Exactly.
Why we need faith. And faith, when we talk about faith, we're not talking about religion. We're talking about inner belief. We're talking about that collection of experience. And then how many times have you thought you knew the right thing to do and you felt it was the right thing to do, but for whatever reason, you couldn't take action on it? So for it to be courageous, it needs to be all three.
Yeah, no, and I love it because, it's almost like a 3-legged stool. If you take one of those out, your stool's broken. Because if you take out the knowledge and you just have faith and action, well, that is the blind leap of faith, and that does not work very well in work or life, right? And like you said, if you take out the faith and you just have knowledge and action, well, that might work, but you might get stuck in that, no, we need 100% knowledge before we can actually get to action, right? And then if you take out action and you have knowledge and faith, well, that's great, but what are you doing with it? So you need all three. If even one of them is missing, then you've got a broken stool there. It doesn't work, and you don't get to take that courageous move, as it were.
I mean,
love that.
Perfectly stated. Yeah, I always say knowledge and faith without action is paralysis.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And,
Analysis paralysis,
right?
right?
And faith and action without knowledge is reckless.
Yep.
And knowledge and
Exactly.
action without faith, if you're going through the motions and you're numb on the inside, you're working on status quo.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. So tell us about your book. You mentioned it. I think it's fairly hot off the presses. It's called Return on Courage.
Yep.
What's it about? How long did it, take you to write it? And who did you interview? Like, give us the whole rundown on it, because it sounds awesome.
Oh, it was if you study classic storytelling, it was one of those perfect, the protagonist goes on the journey to write the book for one reason and, comes out with an entirely different sort of treasure of the writing process. So, it took me 1,000 days to write the book. And I describe it more like a documentary, frankly, because when I didn't have the answer, I would go in search of it. And I had a chance to interview the 3 Bs, the brave, the bullish, and the brainiac. And on the brave side, I had a chance to sit with an astronaut, a Navy SEAL, a tornado chaser. Excuse me.
Cool.
And I was curious as to, like, how do they do what they do? Like, why do they do what they do? Understand how purpose really plays when you have a higher calling purpose, how important that is. And then on the bullish side, I interviewed people at Apple and Google and Amazon, Method Soap, Domino's, Harvard. And I was fascinated by how some of the largest companies on the planet were also the most agile. And you would think it was the little guy that was nimble. But these companies were putting process and infrastructure and resources towards figuring out their tomorrow. And then the big surprise was the brainiac. So clinical psychologists, immunologists, Cambridge PhDs. One of the guys that was my brain Sherpa was a guy named Nicholas Alp, who really kind of made it easy for me to understand what's really calling the shots. And we have this thing called our central nervous system. And when was the last time you just had that come up in a dinner conversation?
Right.
How's your central nervous system, honey? It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. And so what you realize is that system is designed to do exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to keep you safe, but it doesn't mean it's in the best interest of you.
Right.
And so the aha moment for me was, wow, it's interesting. What if I could create a process that helped companies develop what I call central courage system to combat your central nervous system? And what Nicholas taught me was that we basically haven't let go of all that negative stuff that's happened to us in the past. Imagine your brain is like a reverse onion, and it's layer on top of layer on top of layer. That first boss who bit your head off, you moved to a new city and it didn't work out. Have you actually ever walked the halls of your high school recently?
Oh, I know, right? Yep. It's all in there. All those negative little things, they all pile up on top of each other, right? And we don't let go of them very fast, if at all.
If at all. And we haven't really created strategies to deal with it. So that kind of then sent me down this path. Was I wonder if I could come up with a strategy that could almost short circuit your central nervous system. And the experts say that 95% of us are freeze or flight and only 5% of us are fight. That means 95% of companies are freeze or flight, 5% are fight. You're in a room with 100 colleagues, 95 of them are stuck, and maybe 5 of them have a shot.
Right.
And so I wanted to get you into the 5%. And that's why I feel so strongly about courage being a competitive advantage. If we can teach you to be calculated with that courage, trust the right knowledge, build that internal faith so you know where to take action, knowing that all these other people or companies are spinning, that's the competitive advantage that I see for companies moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. And now you talk about you can courageous a special forces change company. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a lot of words, isn't it? I mean, basically it means that our model is listening first and understanding what the problem is, and then custom building our team. So I describe it as like 90% SWAT team, 10% search consultant. And there's 3 missions that we take on. There's a conviction mission, which is behind the curtain, getting courageous leadership, courageous organizations, courageous teams. We're looking at your values and your purpose, and making sure that you have your story straight so you won't have an attrition problem.
Mm-hmm.
There's a second mission is a communication mission. I'm a recovering ad guy. So coming out of the advertising arena, I learned to tell stories in 10 to 15 seconds in commercials.
Yeah.
So helping companies sort of structure their story, which is why people will believe and stick around, or customers will believe. And then the third mission is an innovation mission. So under the guise of what we know about your brand, helping you think through new revenue opportunities for the company and to start working on your pivot. And as we learn more about a leadership team who hires us, we're custom building that team for each particular mission.
I love it. I love what you do. And I think, the core of your message is just so relevant and powerful, because it really is, especially now, it's only the courageous companies that are surviving, right? I mean, I think you had a stat on your website that since 2000, 52% of Fortune 500s have gone under. I mean, that, when you really stop and think about it, that's 20 years, 52% of those those are big companies on that list, right? It's not like small businesses where everybody knows, most small businesses don't succeed. We all know that. They're all dead in like 3 years, right? Unless you really work at it and all the rest of it. But big companies, it takes a lot more to actually topple them, for them to bankrupt, for them to fail. And that almost is what does paralyze them, because we've always done it this way, or we have this long legacy, or, we really want to do this exciting and different thing, but geez, what if it doesn't work, right? And all of that is like, they're stuck there in fear and just sticking with status quo. But if you're in status quo, then you're basically like withering on the vine, right?
Yeah, you're, and again, this is a context problem. Because when you walk around your big Fortune 500 company and you're like, we're good, we have a campus, and look at all the people that are here, you can't even fathom that you'd be part of the statistic.
Right.
And so often in my keynotes, it's like a flurry of 8 statistics, one after the other, of like, look, there's 9,000 brands are going to rattle off the Fortune 500 over the next 6 decades. By the way, that number of 52%, that's going to hold. John Chambers, outgoing CEO, Cisco, predicts that 40% of all companies will be dead in 7 years. And it's like, why do I continuously bring up statistic after statistic? Because you don't think the statistic is about you. And I wish there was a better metaphor than this, but I can't think of one. So it's almost like the statistics on cancer. So imagine for 1 minute that your business has cancer. It's got it already. The diagnosis has already come in. And by the way, if the insides could talk, they would probably tell you that the toxicity is spreading around the culture. Right. But maybe you weren't in tune to that the way a positive leader could be or should be.
Right.
So now what do you do? I mean, you could be poor me, and then you're really going to die. Or you could put a plan in place and ask yourself, like, how positive is the culture? Have you surrounded yourself with the right team? Can you get the brand back on a path to being healthy?
Right.
And a lot of that does start with leadership. It does start with listening to your team first and learning from what you hear.
Absolutely.
Right. And then maybe putting in a little bit of love so they know they actually matter. To me, that's what leadership, especially during a pandemic, by the way, really is all about.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, listening is, asking the questions, and then actually listening is where that foundation of trust and building, positive relationships to get to a believership, to use your language, to get to that kind of status, right? Is like, it's got to start with listening, because, as human beings, no matter what our position in an organization might be, whether we're the lowest or the highest on the totem pole, I mean, all of us as human beings want to feel like we're being heard and we're being seen. And if we don't get that where we work, where we spend, at least a third of our waking hours, or half of our waking hours actually, then, that's a tough place to be. And it's not a place where you're going to get what you were talking about earlier, that believership, that buy-in, where people are like, yeah, everything is aligned here. I want to be here. I'm for this company. I'm for this purpose. You know, that's where it all starts to break down. So
And
yeah, I
I
love
would
that.
just touch on that too, Alex, that
Hmm.
if I'm listening to this podcast and feel like I'm 12 layers away from the C-suite, that doesn't mean that you don't have a believership that you're a part of.
Yeah.
And maybe part of this exercise of where you are in your career right now is building that believership inside that culture.
Hmm.
Know who you can turn to for the hard conversations. And you know who you are. If you've had that, got into someone's office and you've closed the door, remember the old days when you were in offices, the good old days,
Right.
and you close the door, that's probably a data point that that person is on your believership, because you can have that quiet conversation and let that just sort of be a testament to, okay, who believes in you? Who do you believe in? How do you continue to build those relationships
Hmm.
as you guys work your way up the ladder at the company you're at? Or maybe you go to a different company. But like, to me, like, it starts now. You don't have to be part of the C-suite to have believers, to be part of a believership. Start working on those skills now.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. I love that you added that. And, you know, I'm curious because, like you said, those numbers, that 52% of the Fortune 500, you know, they're gone. And that kind of, that projection is going to hold. Do you think it actually could get higher because of the pandemic? Because it, you know, for some companies, it's either innovate or die right now. And I mean, innovation takes courage. So what are you seeing? Are you seeing any evidence of that yet? Or is it a little too early to really have a handle on it?
Yeah, I think, well, let me give you one more statistics. This was pre-pandemic. So we'll go
Hmm.
pre-pandemic, and then there's no post-pandemic. We're in pandemic. So
Yes.
we'll do pre-pandemic first. So 50 years ago, if you made it on the Fortune 500, you'd be on that list for 75 years.
Hmm.
So you'd be, take your shoes off. You're good for a while.
Hmm.
Today, it's under 12 years.
Whoa,
Okay, so
that's a big difference.
it's a big difference, and it tells you, the whys might be even more interesting, right? Like, everybody has access to Shopify now, like the democratization of entrepreneurship, and
Yep.
everybody finding their little unique stores where they buy their stuff.
Hmm.
Now, I don't think this is going to answer your question totally, but I'll give a Zoom example. I think late adopters, if they were going to sort of stay connected in any way, were forced to adapt to the pandemic,
Hmm.
right? It's like, if I'm
Oh,
going to have
sure.
any level of connection, I got to figure out Zoom. I got to figure
Yes.
out Teams, right? Is this
Yes.
thing working? And I kind of have time to do it. And
Yep.
so I think, and I used to be on the record saying, hey, less think, more do to companies, so
Mhm.
they weren't overthinking stuff. And right now, I almost think it's flipped: less do, more think.
Mm,
So what I'm hoping has been happening is companies have been thinking about their pivot,
yeah.
about where should they be playing. And if we've learned anything about coming out of like the last even 8 weeks, the companies that have an authentic purpose are the companies that are going to be around.
Yeah.
They're going to keep harmonious cultures. By the way, it's not necessarily fully just because consumers demand it. It's because your employees demand it.
Yeah.
Right. So if
That.
you want employees to stick around, the right employees to stick around, and if they're talented, they want to work for purpose-driven companies that are making the world a better place. Full stop.
Amen. Amen. That is so true. That is so true. So tell us a little bit more about why we need to be courageous right now. I think you talk about 4 truths of the business apocalypse, which again is so intriguing. So we want to know, what is that?
Yeah. So again, the way Return on Courage is written, the front half is really the why now. Like, why
Hmm.
now of all things do we need courage? And then, assuming you've continued to read into the back half of the book, we get into a 3-page chapter that I call break glass before emergency, because you kind of have to learn how to do this stuff before you really need it.
Right.
And then, like I said, I never thought I'd be a guy with the method, but the back half is the how. Like, how do you actually do it? Right? What are the 5 steps to becoming a courageous brand? But up front, like the why now, that business apocalypse, which is very real. I mean, number one, we already talked about it. Companies are perishing at an alarming rate. Right? It is astronomical how fast companies are perishing. Now, some of those numbers, by the way, are mergers and acquisitions. But what's happening is it's more like a takeover.
Yeah.
Where one culture eats the other, and then people are like, I didn't sign up for this or that leader, or I don't buy in on that leadership. And so what happens is that person is now disengaged.
Yeah.
And now they're even a sitting duck during a pandemic where they don't believe in you, but they're not motivated to do anything to make progressive change.
Yeah.
Or the good ones who don't believe in you, they leave. And now you've got to find all this time to find the right person and train them up. And you lose a lot of time, which kind of leads to number 2, which is what got you here won't keep you here. So the thing that you were doing, you need to start working on your tomorrow. Number 3, by the way, is you need time, but you don't have time. So that's pretty brutal, right? Because you're like, well, I know I got to work on tomorrow, but with what time? And then number 4 is we're literally wired to fear change.
Yeah.
So we don't like change. That's the whole brain side of it. We fear change. And there's a famous proverb that fear and courage are brothers, that you actually can't get to the courageous move without sort of pushing through that fear. But most of us like to suppress that fear versus address the fear.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's the idea. Is like, let's smoke out the fear and talk about it as a team.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, you mentioned time a few times in there. And I think that is, time is sort of the great equalizer, because if you are experiencing success, awesome. But as you said, what got you there isn't going to keep you there. So even if it's working right now, and we sort of go with the old adage of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Which is what so many people subscribe to. Back to your point about, we fear change, we're reluctant to change, right? Like, it's not a place we want to be. So it's like, hey, it's working. Let's not alter the winning formula.
Yeah.
But everything fails over time, right?
Yeah.
And the pandemic has certainly taught us that, right? I mean, sooner or later, what was working is not going to work. And if you wait until it's in the decline, right? I mean, for those of you who aren't watching, I'm making sort of a symbol of a bell curve, right? So if you're at the top of the bell curve, it's working, success, awesome. And everybody thinks that, oh yeah, it's going to keep going. We're going to just go plateau here. We're going to keep growing. No, over time, you're going to start to decline. You come down the other side of that bell curve. And if you wait until that point, it's almost too late. Because
Correct.
like you said, now you're scrambling and you don't even have the bandwidth to be creative, be innovative, because it's like survival time, right?
Correct.
So it's like time is this great equalizer. If you're not paying attention and not looking for those opportunities to make a courageous move or be innovative, it's like you could find yourself on the back end of that bell curve really fast.
So I think this is really a conversation about relevance.
Yeah.
Right. And for the listeners, ask yourself, if you had to put yourself in one of the buckets, which bucket would you put yourself in? Are you a business that is proactive? Are you reactive? Or are you inactive?
Yeah.
And the inactive might, don't lie to yourself. Like, you may know the right thing to do, but this is knowledge and faith without action, right? This is, we know the right thing, we feel it's right, and for whatever reason, we're not committing any budget or process towards it. Reactive, to your point, it's kind of like that oh no moment that happened, and now you're like, okay, we now have to respond to this.
Exactly.
And the proactive team, and again, remember, studying these big companies like Google and Amazon, and yes, it must be nice to have their resources, but like, you as the leader must create a process where you take your budget. Maybe it's 5% of your budget, and you create what I call an experimental task force. And maybe it's not every single person with a C-suite title. It's a diversified group. You got somebody who's been on the job for 3 months, maybe who isn't brainwashed by the Kool-Aid of the company,
Right.
that isn't afraid to speak up. And that experimental task force is responsible 6 months later with coming back with recommendations for the organization.
Mm.
Now, maybe it's an experiment, right? So maybe there's no recommendation yet, but there's a lot of learnings.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the things that Google does very well. I interviewed Jason Sparrow, a vice president on the team. He gives his team 5% of his budget, says, I'll cover you guys from leadership, but
Mm-hmm.
come back with something that I can move 20% of my budget to next year.
Mm.
Okay. They're not
Yeah.
responding to, he's not saying come back with the solution on blank.
Yep.
He's like, go be proactive and report back on what you learn.
Yeah. And so there's a reason that Google continues to do well, right? And
Yeah.
so many of those, like Amazon is a good example of that too, right? They're always proactively looking for that next space to get into. Yeah. I love that. So I know you're tight for time. So last question before we kind of wrap things up. If you were going to give our listeners, our leaders that are listening, some advice about being more courageous, or maybe it's not about being let me back up. What is your advice in terms of courage for the leaders who are listening today?
I mean, again, if you're listening to this podcast and you've made it to minute 32, whatever this is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that already says so much about you. You know, we're not having a conversation here on are we aligned? Like, I know that you believe in this content or
Mhm.
you wouldn't stick around. And
Right.
I think it's really about like, how do you take this forward and find your people? And look, there's no question, like if you're not courageous, some other company will be. And if you want to be that sort of change agent that you probably are, then how are you going to bring people along for the ride? I'll share this. The other title that I was playing around with for the book, and I thought it was too narrow, was Willing Courage Brands.
Mm.
And, I love what it sounds like, but I thought it was too, like I said, too narrow. The idea of being willing is to be open to someone else's perspective. And as leaders, yeah, are you willing to listen to your team? Are you open to hearing their perspective? And then once we make a decision together, can we will it through? Right?
Yeah.
Do we have what it takes to will the project along and see it through? To me, that's just another way of saying courage, right? It's like another way of like following that path and taking that action off of the knowledge that you have and the belief that you have. And again, the reason the book is called Return on Courage is it showcases a bunch of brands that showed a KPI for making the courageous move in the market.
Yeah. I mean, right. And that's sort of the whole piece on this that we actually didn't touch on. But I mean, there's a massive argument about basically the bottom line argument in being creative, in being courageous, in being innovative, right? It's those companies that are making these courageous moves that are seeing their returns grow and grow, right?
Yeah. And again, your job is to be one of those companies. And I think that's one of the hard realities is that companies, they do get in their way or they do rest on their laurels or they say that's how we've always done it, like you said.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's hard to be the person that stands up in the room and says, maybe we should rethink how we're doing things. And in an odd way, Alex, and it comes off as a shameless book promotion, but what I've learned is, do you have 5 minutes is a hard thing to ask somebody sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
but gifting knowledge and be like, have you read this book? Have you heard about this book? Is an easy way. It's a permission slip for a hard conversation about change. And no question, change is hard, but the hardships of not changing are far harder.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen to that. So thank you so much for being here. I mean, so many nuggets of goodness and wisdom here from you today. So what if people want more, Ryan? I mean, how can they get in touch with you? How do they connect with you further? And I think you also have an offer to share, and you just launched a podcast. So tell us all these things so that people can follow you and get in touch with you if they feel like, hey, we need some courage work happening in our organization.
Yeah. So for starters, because let's start with the podcast. Actually, just this week we launched the Courageous podcast.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's available at Apple Podcasts. It's on Spotify as well. And we spent the last year talking to astronauts and Navy SEALs and Brain Sherpas, and Tony Shakes, who's in your backyard,
Yep.
is coming on. So we're just revealed or launched our first episode yesterday with Loretta Hidalgo, who's an astronaut.
Fantastic.
So if you're ready to rethink the way you think about the world, then start there. If you want more on our company, you can check out couragebrands.com. If you want to buy the book, returnoncourage.com. And I know we didn't really go into it in too much detail here, but if you want to better understand yourself and self-lead yourself, then it often starts with really reassessing your personal core values. And email me at ryanberman@couragebrands.com, and I will send you the assessment. It's not a quiz. It's just giving you the tools to really audit yourself, treat yourself like a brand, treat yourself like a business. And I think once you self-lead yourself, it does make it a little bit easier to lead others.
Absolutely. I mean, becoming more self-aware. I mean, as leaders, we have to be self-aware, right? So if we don't even know what our own core values are, we're a little fuzzy on that. And how can we self-lead? How can we lead others? I love that. So thank you for sharing so many cool and fabulous ways to connect with Ryan and get more of his wisdom and insights. I am so grateful that you joined us here today. Thank you so much for being on the show. I know our listeners are going to get so much value. In fact, I think this is definitely a must listen to again episode because there were just so many golden pieces of wisdom in there. So thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it.
You got it. Thanks, Alex.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
All right. Okay, well, that's it from us this week. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode. We really were treated to some fabulous insights about why courage is so important in ourselves as leaders, but also our organizations, and the return that we can get if we have the courage to put together our knowledge, our action, and our faith. I loved Ryan's formula there. Knowledge plus faith plus action equals courage. So if you've got positive leadership stories to share about courage, or if you have questions on this topic, write to me at questions@positiveleadershipmovement.com. I always love to hear from you. That's it for us this week. Thank you for being part of the Positive Leadership Movement and for inspiring me to do what I do every single day.
Make sure you subscribe to the show. If you like this episode, please rate and review. If you want to get more from Alex, check out Happiness at Work, where she provides leaders with a proven path to cultivate a positive work culture that increases performance, productivity, and profitability. Go to happinessatworknow.com. Join us next week and harness the power of positive leadership for your organization.